Hi, everybody. My name is Nicole, and today we're going to be finishing reading Nancy Drew and the Bike Tour Mystery by Carolyn Keene. And we're going to be picking up where we last off last time on Chapter 9. It's called Slipping Away. Holding her breath, Nancy sidled around the floor-to-ceiling display case. Was it the same man she'd seen at Shannon? The same man who'd been talking to Rhonda in the alleyway that morning? Peeking around the corner of the display case, Nancy got her first really good look at the mystery man. His broad shoulders, massive forehead, and terse expression were what had drawn her attention before. Now she took in his short, greasy brown hair and small, dark eyes. He looked like he was in his mid-30s. Beneath the formal-looking overcoat, he wore faded jeans and sneakers. As the man looked over his shoulder, Nancy ducked so he wouldn't see her. "Miss?" she heard his harsh, nasal voice call out to the shopkeeper. "Yes?" The shopkeeper strolled over to him. "The sign says this pattern is called Clostermere Manor," the man said. His accent certainly sounded Australian, Nancy thought. "Yes, that's what the potter named it. I had an aunt who was a parlour maid at the Clostermere Manor before she came out to Australia," the man said. "She always showed me pictures of the place. Tell me, would Clostermere be near here?" Leaning forward to listen, Nancy brushed accidentally against the display shelf. The ceramic pieces on the shelf wobbled and clinked. She could hear the man hastily plunk down the mug and brush past the sales clerk. Nancy whirled around and pretended to browse on another shelf. "Please don't recognize me," she wished silently. Then she heard a heavy tread and the shop door swishing open. Nancy sprang to where she could see the doorway. A broad-shouldered back, clad in black wool, was shoving hurriedly out to the street. "George, come on!" Nancy called her friend. George, well used to Nancy's sudden moves, set down the casserole dish she'd been admiring. "I'll be back," she promised the shopkeeper as she bounded across the store, following Nancy out to the street. Nancy hesitated a moment on the sidewalk. The way his body tilted, I guess he went to the right, she decided, and sprinted down along the sloping street in that direction. George was right behind her. "Who was it, Nan?" "The Australian guy with the missing pinky." Nancy felt pretty sure she'd seen a black shape turn left by the red-painted shop front across the way. Dodging and weaving through the afternoon shopping crowd, she raced around the corner after him. Her quick eyes picked him out right up ahead, this time popping into an alley to his right. Nimbly, Nancy leaped over a woman's shopping bag set down on the cobbles and ducked under a display of finely woven shawls. She couldn't lose the trail this time. Running into the mouth of the alley, Nancy spied the black coat up ahead. The man was running hard now. Obviously he knew Nancy was after him. She urged her legs to go faster, willing herself to ignore the sore muscles of 2 days bicycling. The man swung left into a larger street. "I'm closing in on him now," Nancy thought triumphantly. But as she turned left at the corner, she skidded to a halt. He was nowhere to be seen. Nancy pivoted to the right, wondering if he'd faked her out with a false turn. She couldn't see him there either. Maybe he went into a store, she mused. But which? She peered into the large front window of a jewelry shop, but he wasn't there. She slipped into a bookstore across the street, searching between his rows of bookcases. No luck. Nancy's throat tightened. The trail was swiftly growing cold. In the heart of a city, there were so many places where a man could hide. Discouraged, she retraced her route through the winding, narrow streets. She spotted George leaning against a brick wall. "Nancy, I lost you. Where'd you go?" "He got away," Nancy sighed. "Well, cheer up," George said. "When I couldn't find you, I circled around this block, and guess what?" Nancy said eagerly, "You saw him?" "No, but I saw his car." George's eyes gleamed. "Or rather, I saw the blue car. But all the evidence suggests it's his, doesn't it?" Nancy drew a careful breath. "We can't assume anything, but let's go have a look." George led Nancy around a couple of corners and emerged in front of a beautiful little gray stone church, crammed between two larger buildings. There was an empty space at the curb by the wrought iron church gate. George's face crumpled in disappointment. It was right here! A blue four-door sedan, same size, same color, same style as the one that chased Rhonda and Rachel today. Nancy swallowed her hope. "Don't fret, George. We have no proof it belongs to our Mr. Black anyway." "But if we could have seen who got into it—" George slammed her fist into her palm in frustration. "He may have run back to get the car as soon as he shook me off his trail," Nancy said. "If so, we have no hope of catching him on foot." "Well, at least I wrote down the license plate number," George said. Nancy clapped her friend on the shoulder. "Good work, George!" "Hey, I haven't tagged along on all your cases for nothing," George remarked. She bent over and fished a folded scrap of paper out of her shoe. One bad thing about these cycling shorts, no pockets, she noted with a rueful grin. Nancy studied the paper, a torn-up bit of newspaper. G500A7, she read. Are you going to ask the police to check it out? Nancy scrunched up her nose. Frankly, George, I don't think they cooperate. This isn't River Heights, where the police might check a license number for me because they know me and my dad. The Irish police, or the Garda as they're called, have no reason to take my word I'm a detective, and there's no actual crime to investigate. Rhonda and Rachel haven't reported anything to the authorities, remember? What if we got Bob to report the incidents? George suggested. His company does a lot of business in Ireland. Considering how important tourism is around here, I think the police would be anxious to protect innocent travelers. Nancy cocked her head. It's worth a try. My sense is that Bob is getting worried about all these accidents, and if he isn't, he should be. Nancy looked discouraged when she joined Bess and George in their hotel room a couple of hours later. What did Bob say? George asked. Nancy plopped down on the bed with its spring muslin counterpane. Tonight's lodging was a charming bed and breakfast full of antiques. Bob says he can't go to the police without Rhonda's and Rachel's permission, Nancy reported. He was adamant about it. Why are they so reluctant to take any help? Bess wondered, turning from the mirror where she'd been admiring her pale blue sweater. Nancy shrugged. I don't know, but Bob's so afraid of crossing them he can hardly think straight. He kept saying that this is a string of ordinary mishaps. But from the tone of his voice, I don't think he believes that himself. Wearily, she opened her suitcase, pulling out the navy knit dress she planned to wear to dinner. The tour group was eating tonight at a seafood restaurant on Quay Street, near the Galway Harbor. I suspect Rhonda and Rachel aren't just any customers, George said. They certainly seem rich, for one thing. I agree, Nancy said. All the more reason why someone might really be after them. Like our Mr. Black? Bess asked. Or Terry O'Leary, or Derek, or whoever was driving that blue car, Nancy said, pondering as she unbuttoned her shirt. We've got an open field of suspects. One thing I do know. Mr. Black knows I'm on his trail, and he sure acts like he's got something to hide. So this is officially a case, Nancy? George asked. Nancy blew out a sigh. If it is, it's a weird sort of case. I don't really have a client. Rhonda and Rachel never hired me. In fact, they keep avoiding you, George said. That's not true. Rachel's friendly again, Bess remarked. Yes, but that was today when Rachel was on her own. With Rhonda back on the scene, I bet things will be different, Nancy warned. Gathering evidence will be tough, George said. We're constantly on the move, not only the suspects, but the victims as well. And we ourselves have to keep moving, Nancy added. We can't go back and forth investigating the scenes of these crimes. Especially not when we're only on bikes, Bess said. All the same, I've got to do something. I can't just sit around. And Nancy pressed her lips together in a determined expression her friends knew very well. Nancy made a point of lingering the next morning over her breakfast of soda bread and grilled fish. She watched as the other members of the tour went off to start their rides. First Rachel and Rhonda, then the DeFuscos and Carl Thompson, and finally Derek and Camilla with Bob. Bess and George were the last to get on their bikes. Bob thinks I'm riding with you guys, Nancy reminded them as they stood in front of the hotel. So don't ride too fast, and I'll catch up as soon as I'm done. Keep an eye out for Terry, George reminded her. The van's still in the parking lot, waiting for him to load the luggage. I'll be careful, Nancy promised. She waved to her friends as they wheeled into the quiet street outside the bed and breakfast. As soon as the coast seemed clear, Nancy walked back into the bed and breakfast. Looking as nonchalant as possible, she went up the mahogany staircase to the second floor. She sauntered down the wide, sunny hallway to room number 4, the room where Rachel and Rhonda had slept last night. A red-haired teenager was bustling down the hall with an armload of dirty sheets. Oh, miss, Nancy said. I just checked out of room 4, and I'm missing something. Could you open the door so I can check if I left it in my room? The maid shrugged. No bother, ma'am. She dropped the linens in a heap and pulled a master key from her apron pocket. In a minute, Nancy was in Rhonda and Rachel's room. She was taken aback to see how messy the girls had left the room. They must be used to having servants pick up for them, she thought. Sheets were half pulled off the bed, and wet towels lay in puddles on the carpet. Balled-up candy wrappers were strewn over the desk. A half-empty bottle of nail polish stood on the TV set, brush balanced precariously on top. Empty soda cans were lined up on the antique dresser, leaving white rings on its dark polished top. Keeping an eye on the half-open door, Nancy began to methodically inspect the room. She started with the wastebasket, but it was empty. Beside it, however, lay a crumpled copy of a tabloid newspaper. She scooped its pages into order and stuffed it in her small day pack to read later. Who knew? It might contain a clue. Just then, Nancy straightened up with a jerk and whirled around. There stood Derek Thorogood, looking as shocked to see her as she was to see him. Derek, what are you doing here? Nancy gasped. Derek glared. First, you better tell me what you're doing here, Nancy. Now we're on Chapter 10. Who's After Whom? Nancy knew she had to act cool. I'm doing Rhonda a favor. She asked me to come back and grab her guidebook. She dug her hand into her day pack and pulled out her own travel guide to Ireland. See, here it is. Derek tilted his head in a way that told Nancy he wasn't convinced. Well, I came back to get a cable for my laptop. Silly me, I left it in the outlet. In Rhonda and Rachel's room, Nancy cast him a suspicious look. What was Derek up to? Derek raised his eyebrows, looking innocent. This is their room? Unless you wear nail polish, it is, Nancy said, pointing to the bottle on the TV set. Oh, I never wear nail polish. At least not in the daytime, Derek joked. He flashed Nancy a charming smile. When he used to get out of jams, Nancy suspected. But you're right. Now I realize this wasn't my room. I get so confused staying in a new hotel every night. It struck Nancy that Derek might have come back here for the same reason she had, to search Rhonda and Rachel's room. But why? What could he be hunting for? You better go look for your own room, Nancy said. Good luck finding your cable. Now that you've fetched Rhonda's book, Derek said, nodding toward the guidebook in her hand, you can accompany me. Nancy stifled a groan. She'd never be able to search the room with Derek hovering around, and he seemed to know it. Their eyes locked, each one determined not to leave the other in the room. The standoff ended only when the maid peeked around the door. Did you find what you left, miss? Nancy gave a sigh of surrender. Yes, thank you. She trudged out of the room, Derek following her. The maid pulled the door shut behind them. Nancy heard the lock click. So which room was yours? Nancy said, trying to pin Derek down. Other end of the hall, I think. He strolled to an open door with a brass numeral 8 on it. This was it. I remember now. He stuck his head briefly aside the room. Not here. Perhaps I unplugged the cable after all, and packed it in the side pocket of my case. I'll check tonight. Not to worry. If I've lost it, it's easily replaced. Well, Nancy, he gestured toward the staircase. Shall we go? Nancy strolled down the hallway and downstairs, fighting to hide her irritation. Only a temporary setback, she told herself. Tonight, I'll find a way to search Rhonda and Rachel's bedroom, wherever we're staying. That'll be better anyway, while their stuff's actually in the room. Walking outside, Nancy saw Derek's 10-speed pipe propped against the garden fence beside hers. At least now we can ride together, Nancy said. Super, I got one of the mobiles, Derek said, showing her the cell phone and a copy of today's map. Just then, the red tour van came rolling out of the parking lot. Terry O'Leary braked when he saw them and rolled down his window. No lagging about, he said crossly. You'll be missing the ferry. There's not another for hours. We'll hurry, Nancy promised. Luckily, their ride was all downhill from the B&B to the harbor. A steam ferry boat was waiting at the docks, its engine rumbling. As soon as Nancy and Derek rode up the gangplank, the crew raised it and the boat set off. Ooh, that was tight, Derek said lightly. Shall we find the others? George and Bess looked relieved when Nancy arrived on deck. Glad you made it, George said. Find anything? Just Derek, Nancy murmured. Bess and George raised their eyebrows, but Derek was moving toward them, and she couldn't say more. The ocean air was salty and brisk, and Nancy tugged her baseball cap tighter over her red blonde hair. Derek leaned suavely on the railing next to Bess and launched into a stream of chatter, but Nancy tuned it out. She reviewed in her mind the facts of the case. The Australian man, or Mr. Black, as Nancy had nicknamed him, was her biggest question mark. But she still wanted to know more about Terry O'Leary, and Derek's appearance at the Selkirk's room this morning troubled her. What reason could he have for snooping in the room? He's probably wondering the same thing about me, Nancy told herself. That must be why he was sticking so close to her now, she realized with a flash of irritation. As the ferry steamed across the harbor, the quaint medieval buildings of Galway City grew smaller and smaller, and the dark humps of land lying about in the ocean grew larger. If you thought County Clare was picturesque, wait till you see the Aran Isles, Bob said, joining them. The smaller islands don't have car traffic, and some cottages still lack electricity or plumbing. The land is nearly as rocky as the Burren. Farmers have to make soil from sand and rotten seaweed. Bess wrinkled her nose. Ew! Bob grinned. I agree. If I lived here, I'd sure try to be a fisherman instead. But Aran Islanders are hardy, plain living folks used to fighting the elements. Most of them speak Gaelic, don't they? Derek asked. You know, the Old Irish language? Bob nodded. Older folks do, and kids learn it in school. They're trying to keep it alive. But the same is true all over Western Galway and Donegal. Look at the road signs. Town names are usually in Gaelic as well as English. How soon will you reach the island? Bess asked. The ride is over 3 hours, Bob said. Coming back, we can sail to Rosaville, which only takes an hour. Too bad we only have time to see the big island, Inishmore. But the fort there, Dunangus, is spectacular. It's centuries old, and no one knows who built it, or why they needed to protect that lonesome bit of island. It's a mysterious ancient place, like Stonehenge. Inishmore's port village, Kilronan, was a bit touristy, with tour guides and minibuses buzzing around trying to pick up customers. Nancy was glad they had their bikes and could ride out of town on their own. The road to the ruined stone fort led straight out of Kilronan. In only a few minutes, the route was pedaling along a seaside line of cliffs. As usual, Rhonda and Rachel zipped off in front. But as Nancy and George began to follow, Derek comes up behind them. Can I ride with you two? Sure, Nancy said, hiding her frustration. From the looks of Derek's specialized cycling clothes and equipment, Nancy had assumed he was an expert cyclist. Now she learned differently. Derek had to look down at his gear levels every time he needed to shift. And despite his trim, athletic build, his legs weren't very muscular. As soon as he had to pedal hard, he lurched from side to side to give his legs an extra boost. George shot Nancy a meaningful glance behind Derek's back. She taught Nancy that extra motion, like that, dragged on the bike and slowed you down. By the time the three of them reached the hilltop fort, the Selkirk's magenta bikes were already in the parking lot, along with Bob's silver racer. The McLaney van was parked there too. Terry O'Leary sat in the driver's seat, eyes closed, snoring. I guess he's seen this sight before, George remarked wryly as they parked their bikes. Tourists swarmed over the broken stone ruins, perched at the edge of the cliff. Walking up a rocky rise to overlook the site, Nancy was impressed by how large the prehistoric fort was. It had been built in 3 concentric circles, the highest in the middle. Shallow depressions in the sparse grass showed where missing parts of the once grand design had lain. The remaining stones, bleached pale by years of sea wind, reflected the sunshine with hard glitter. Nancy laid a hand on the nearby rock, awed by the thought of how long the rock had lain there. The stern gray stone was softened by patches of velvety moss and greenish-gray lichens, flourishing in the wet sea air. Now there's a sight for you, Derek said, coming up behind her. With a sweep of his arm, he indicated the vast panorama of the flinty island and the mainland across the water. That's a splendid view of Connemara over there. Bess, cheeks still flushed from cycling, popped up behind Derek. Connemara, she said. But we're looking east. Isn't that Galway? The western part of Galway is also called Connemara, Derek said, pulling Bob's right up out of the back pocket of his red spandex jersey. With a glance, Nancy signaled Bess to keep Derek occupied. Bess nodded. But Carl was just telling me that it was called Gaeltacht, she said innocently, because so many people there speak Gaelic. Nancy quietly backed away and left them. She strode deeper into the fort, searching for the Selkirks. She soon spotted Rhonda, lounging on a large flat stone. Rhonda waved at Nancy. Nancy waved back, but a chill ran up her spine. It seemed disrespectful to her to climb onto these rocks that had endured so long, silent witnesses to the passing ages. Still, since Rhonda was alone, it was an ideal time to question her. We missed you at dinner last night, Nancy said, strolling over to her. I needed a night's rest, Rhonda said, propping herself on her elbows, after my spill yesterday. Terry got your wheel fixed? Oh, sure, good as new, Rhonda replied. No mention of the fact that it had been her sister's bike that had really needed the repair, Nancy noted. Any idea who hit you? Rhonda shrugged, her gaze sliding sideways. Simple traffic thing, I reckon. Cyclists have them all the time. But after the trouble with the soda the first night, and your sister in the pub sign? Rhonda sat up and swung her legs over the side of the rock. She shot a piercing look at Nancy. Look here, Nancy, what are you getting at? Nancy stilled herself. I think someone's after you, she said. The Australian man you were talking to yesterday morning. I saw him at Shannon, and I saw him again yesterday in Galway City. He's following us. I don't know any such bloke, Rhonda insisted. Is this how you get all your cases, Nancy, by making things up? Well, excuse me, but I rode hard this morning. I'm ready to eat. She shouldered past Nancy and went toward Bob and Terry, who were laying out the picnic. I blew it again, Nancy thought bitterly. Reluctant to join the picnic just yet, Nancy looked around for Rachel. She spied her on the far side of the site, leaning dreamily on a shattered wall at the edge of the cliff. Then Nancy saw Derek hiding behind a nearby boulder, watching Rachel. Quickly, Nancy circled around the site, stumbling slightly in the overgrown ruts and declivities. Eyes on Rachel, she paused next to a taller fragment of wall. Her hand reached out to steady herself on its time-worn, pitted surface. She could see Rachel, about 50 yards away, but Derek had ducked behind the boulder and was out of sight. Where had he gone to? Something above Nancy blocked out the watery Irish sunshine. There was a whistling sound in the air. She looked up. A huge chunk of ancient stone was stumbling straight towards Nancy. Excuse me. Alright, and now we're on chapter 11, Over the Edge. Nancy twisted her body and sprang to the right to avoid the falling rock. It just missed grazing her left shoulder. As her right foot landed, she came down at an angle on a broken bit of stone. Her ankle buckled and she fell sideways. She tried to break her fall, but her shoe slid on a crumbling patch of dirt and shot out into the open air over the rim of the cliff. Nancy clutched at the ground behind her. Her fingers closed on an upthrust rock and hung on tight. The falling stone crashed on another rock, jolted and tumbled a few feet, then disappeared over the cliff. Holding on, Nancy cautiously peered over the edge. 300 feet below, the ocean sparkled, cold and gray. There was a distant splash as the boulder plunged into the sea. That could have been me, Nancy realized. She twisted around to see where the stone had come from. The jagged fragment of wall sat there, impassive, grass sprouting from its cracks. A coating of mud showed where the fallen stone had been dislodged. A stone cemented in place by soil doesn't just fall, Nancy thought. Somebody pushed it. Nancy sprawled, shaking with relief on the grass. Bob came rushing over. Are you okay? Terry said he saw a falling rock nearly hit you. The rock missed me, thank goodness, Nancy said, rubbing her sore ankle. But Bob, that stone has been there for centuries. Why would it fall today? And was it just coincidence that Terry was there to see it fall? She added silently. Well, so long as you're all right, Bob said hurriedly. Come over to the picnic and rest. Nancy bit her lip. Why was Bob so blind to the fact that danger was dogging the tour? George and Bess reached Nancy with Rachel, Natalie, and Carl trotting up behind. Nancy looked around for Derek. He stood off to the side with Rhonda, muttering something in her ear. Derek was nearby just before the rock fell, too, Nancy reminded herself. She cast Derek a searching look. He simply turned away. Fingers flying over the strings, a young fiddler set a merry jig into the high-ceilinged community hall. Percussion was provided by the feet of a dozen dancers in black leather slippers and short black skirts, executing the skirling motions of a traditional Irish step dance. How young do you think that little girl is? Bess wondered, pointing to the smallest dancer in the troupe. Barely 4 feet tall, she had the round face of a 6 or 7-year-old. Her dark curls bobbed frantically as she hopped up and down to the music, eyes straight ahead. She must have taken up stepping as soon as she could walk to be this good already, Bess marveled. Forehead furrowed, George studied the dancers' moves. I can't believe how high they get their knees up. And see how they hold their upper bodies totally rigid, arms down at their sides? It must take perfect balance to move that way. Rhonda, sitting on the wooden bench behind theirs, leaned forward. It's even harder to do it than it looks, she said. With all the Irish folk in Australia, step dancing's popular, and I used to take lessons. I was a dismal failure, no joke. Nancy answered with a thin smile. Rhonda had been clinging to her like a burr ever since they left the fort. With Rhonda around, Nancy could hardly investigate anyone's rooms at tonight's inn. Nancy recalled Derek confiding something to Rhonda that afternoon. Had he told her about finding Nancy in the hotel this morning? Was that why Rhonda suddenly wouldn't leave her alone? The fiddler ended the song with a sharp downward stroke of his bow, and the dancers smartly stamped their feet together. The crowd burst into raucous clapping. The leader of the troupe stepped forward, beaming. Thank you very much, she called out as the clapping dwindled. Now it's not fair for us to have all the fun, is it? Who else would like to get their bones a-moving and their hearts a-pumping? Hands flew up around the room. Come on, gents as well as ladies, she coaxed the crowd. Benches were pushed back to clear space on the linoleum floor, and dancers fanned out to work with small groups of visitors. Nancy, George, Bess, and Rhonda, along with a couple of women from another tour group, teamed up with a raven-haired dancer named Moira. Lining up behind her, they copied her steps in slow motion, tap, step, hop, she called out. Pivoting around, she watched her pupils copy the steps. Nancy's mind was wiped clear of everything but the effort to dance. She found that as soon as she got her feet moving right, she forgot to keep her spine straight. When she got her back and feet together, she realized her arms were swinging outward for balance. She caught Bess's eye, and they both giggled. George frowned at them and executed a tap pivot step move. Arms straight down, but no fists, Moira advised George. She laid her hands flat against her thighs, fingers pointing down. Like so, and don't hunch your shoulders. Bess and Nancy traded glances and went into another giggle fit. After an hour of tapping, stepping, and hopping, the visitors were glad to collapse back onto the benches and watch the train dancers perform again. Now I really appreciate how hard it is, George said to Nancy as the dance troupe launched into an intricate routine, pairing up, forming wheels, and weaving lines together. Nancy grinned and nodded, but as she turned her head, she noticed Camilla leaving the hall by a side door. Nancy searched the crowd for Derek. She saw him leaning against the side wall, head close to Rachel's, murmuring in a low voice. Rachel smiled and blushed, and Derek bent closely towards her. Nancy bit her lip. Which Selkirk was Derek interested in, Rhonda or Rachel? And how dare he hit on Rachel here with Camilla looking on? The night air felt cool against their flushed faces. The night air felt cool against their flushed faces as they walked back through the village to their inn. George whistled a reel while Bess hopped and skipped along, but Nancy was quiet and distracted. She was keenly aware that Rhonda, Rachel, and Derek were walking arm in arm only a few steps behind them. They soon reached the inn, a restored farmhouse overlooking one of Connemara's largest lakes, Loch Corrib. Nancy managed to smile as they said goodnight to the sisters and Derek, but she felt sour inside. So much for investigating, Nancy burst out, kicking her shoes as they entered the bedroom. And just when the case is heating up. My theory looks more likely all the time, George declared. Someone's sabotaging the tour. One incident every day, and you're the latest victim, Nancy. Maybe so, George, Nancy said. Rachel was nearby, but not that near. You know, both Derek and Terry know I was poking around the hotel this morning. What if one of them pushed that boulder at me as a warning not to snoop? Bess shivered. I hate to think that. So do I, Nancy agreed. But whoever the target is, dangerous things are happening, and I don't think it'll stop unless we do something. She picked up her day pack and took out the newspaper she'd found that morning in the Selkirk's room. She scanned the splashy front-page photo of a blonde woman and an English football star, cringing from the prying cameras. Bess peered over her shoulder. Yuck, Nancy, she exclaimed. The London Inquirer. Do you really buy this sleazy paper? For what I see, those British rags are worse than the supermarket scandal sheets in the States. Tacky celebrity gossip and hardly anything else. Nancy shrugged. I didn't buy it. I found it in Rhonda and Rachel's room this morning. She flipped the page. Let's figure out why they were reading it. It may lead us to something. She spread the paper on the bed, and the three girls lay side by side, poring over the columns of grubby print. Nancy's hopes faded as they turned one page after another. Then George cried. That's it! She pointed to a small article at the bottom of a page. Nancy frowned. Pop star breaks down on stage. What's that got to do with the Selkirks? It's not what it says, it's who it's by. George tapped her finger by the author's name. Nancy and Bess gasped. By Derek Thorogood, London Inquirer staff, the byline read. That sneak, Nancy spluttered. So that's why he was snooping around Rhonda and Rachel's room, George said. If they've read this paper, they must know who he is by now, Bess reasoned. Maybe not, Nancy said. The article's buried so deep they might not have seen it. It's true, they still seem friendly with Derek tonight, George remarked. Forehead creased in thought, Nancy considered this new twist. But why? Why would a reporter be interested in the Selkirks? Who are they? Spoiled rich girls from Australia, George suggested. That's not newsworthy enough, Nancy said. She drummed her fingers on the bed. We need to do some research on them. But how, Bess said. We're in a tiny village in the middle of Connemara. Nothing's too far from anywhere else in Ireland, Nancy said. We were in Galway City just this morning. It's got a university. There must be a library and cyber cafes there. Bess looked doubtful. We can't all three ditch the tour and go back to Galway City. Derek would notice, and so would Rhonda and Rachel. That's why we're not all going, Nancy said. But if one slips away, she looked hopefully at Bess. You're so good at research, Bess. Whoa, not me, Bess protested. Go an extra day's ride out of the way? It was a full day's ride along the coast, Nancy said. But by inland road it's not so far. Please, Bess. Rhonda and Rachel sat on one side of the breakfast room, dawdling over their sneaky bacon and butter toast the next morning. Rhonda kept glancing over at the table where Nancy and George sat. Bess had already slipped away to ride back to Galway City. I don't think they'll leave until we do, George murmured to Nancy. They must know you're waiting to search the room. Nancy grimaced and got to her feet. Then we might as well go ride, she said. But while they're so busy being suspicious of us, Derek could be upstairs pawing through their stuff. I can't believe they trust him more than they do you, George said as she and Nancy walked out into the front hall. You're out to help them. He's out to dig up dirt on them. Loud footsteps told them someone was coming down the stairs. They looked up to see Camilla pounding as she strapped on her helmet. Do you know where Derek is? Nancy inquired, in a casual voice. Derek? Ha! Camilla replied. Her voice curled with scorn, and her eyes blazed. Don't worry, Derek's gone. For good. Excuse me? Alright, and now we're on chapter 12, Banished. Nancy froze in surprise. Derek's gone? With a huffy sigh, Camilla strode out into the paved courtyard. Nancy and George followed. I found a note this morning, Camilla explained. He checked out last night. By now he's at Shannon, waiting to fly to London to file his story. What story? George asked. Camilla checked over her shoulder whether anyone was listening. I'll tell you as we ride. The three girls quickly mounted their bikes and cruised away from the hotel. Once they were on the road, Camilla continued. Derek came on the tour for one reason only, to do a smear job on the Selkirks. But why? Who are they? George asked. Their father is Jacob Selkirk. George and Nancy looked blank. She added, the media tycoon? Never heard of him, Nancy admitted. Well, he started out in Australia, Camilla said, but he's been buying newspapers in the UK over the past 5 years. He's as ruthless as they come. Last year he bought the Clarion, Derek's old paper, a top London daily. Right away, Selkirk sacked a third of the staff, including Derek. So Derek hates him, Nancy guessed. Camilla snorted. I'll say. Derek was out of work for ages till he finally got this post on that horrid rag the London Inquirer. Derek hates it. He'll never forgive Selkirk. So he decided to use the London Inquirer to get revenge, George said. Spot on, Camilla said. You see, Rhonda and Rachel were in London last winter. Every party they went to, every date they had, was covered in the tabloids. They certainly liked to carry on, especially Rhonda. My friend's a McLeany agent in London, and she tipped Derek off about the girls booking this tour. Derek decided to follow them and try to get an incriminating story, or photo. So that's why I had that telephoto lens, Nancy murmured. The ultimate snoop equipment. Too bad he's such an amateur photographer, Camilla sneered. Not a single picture came out. But the Selkirks didn't carry on, George said, except to let Derek flirt with them. Camilla rolled her eyes. You know what to say. Derek said he was flirting to lead him into misbehaving. I played along. But then he started to enjoy it. He liked seeing the Scissors compete for him. We had an awful row about it last night. And that's why he left? George asked. Sort of. But really, Camilla admitted, I just think he was tired of cycling and tired of waiting for a story to materialize. So what will he write? Nancy wondered. Camilla sighed. I suspect he'll just make something up, which could be even worse. Nancy considered this new twist. Had Derek really left, or had he just told Camilla so? And if he was gone, would the danger stop? Today's route lay along the wide lake called Loch Corrib. Terry had dropped off box lunches at a grassy picnic area on the lakeshore. Carl, Jim, Natalie, and Bob were already there eating when the girls rode up. I don't get the point of fly fishing, Natalie was saying, motioning upshore toward tiny figures of anglers, standing thigh-deep in the lake. They never move. How is that a sport? It's a great way to get in touch with nature, Carl remarked. Plus, you end up with fresh grilled trout for lunch, Jim said. with a discouraged look at his thin ham sandwich. Sounds good to me. Nancy opened her box lunch, but she glanced back up the road, unspooling far across the level, brown-green moors. Rhonda and Rachel should have caught up with them by now, but she didn't want to say anything that would prod Bob into taking a head count. No point in making it obvious that Bess wasn't with the group today. When Natalie announced that she and Jim were opting for the shorter route that afternoon, Camilla and Carl decided to join them. As the four cyclists were leaving, Bob got a call on his cell phone. Right, run back and get her, then go up to Cascamara, Nancy heard him say. Call back and let me know how it goes. Bob flipped his phone shut. That was Terry, he informed Nancy and George. Rachel called for a pickup. I guess that means Rhonda's with them. We'll leave their lunches here in case they stop by later. So shall we ride on together? Fine, said Nancy, moving toward their bikes. Hey, we heard that Derek went home. Bob sighed. I know, it's just as well. Now maybe the tour will be peaceful again. Nancy responded quickly. Why? Do you think he's behind all these accidents? Bob paused, perplexed. Why, no. What makes you think that? I just meant he's such a ladies' man. I was afraid a fight would break out. What do you mean by all those accidents? Well, Rhonda passing out, Rachel getting hit by a sign, a car running them off the road, Nancy said. The van hitting George? Not to mention the rock falling at Nancy yesterday, George added. Bob grimaced as he straddled his bike. No one's been hurt. Luckily, Nancy replied, shivering at the memory of her close shave. As they pushed off, she added, Frankly, Bob, I'm worried. We know who Rhonda and Rachel's dad is. What if somebody's out to hurt them? Shouldn't you bring in the police? Bob fell silent, gazing steadily between his handlebars. Rhonda and Rachel insisted, he finally said. That was their main condition when they signed up. No bodyguards, no publicity. It might be too late for that, George said. Did you know Derek's from the London Inquirer? A tabloid reporter? Bob gaped. Oh, this tour is a nightmare. I'll be lucky to keep my job. He looked at the darkening sky. Here comes one of those famous Irish rain showers. Hurry up, let's get to the village over the hill. Nancy, George, and Bob soon whizzed into a quiet cluster of whitewashed buildings. They stashed their bikes and ran inside the nearest shop just as the clouds broke open. Rain drummed on the roof as Nancy and George admired piles of thick cable-knit sweaters and a soft off-white yarn. Those are handmade by Aran Islanders, Bob said. They're incredibly warm. And beautiful, George said, holding one up. I'm definitely buying one. You'll need it tonight, Bob said. We're staying on an island in an old monastery. It's been restored, but it's still drafty. How do we get to the island? Nancy asked. There's a road built out to it, on an old stone jetty, Bob said. But when the tide comes in, the sea covers the road and you're cut off. How romantic, George exclaimed. But Nancy, picking out a sweater for her dad, thought that romantic isolation might not be so good right now. The old monastery's crumbling stone walls and tall arch windows still looked poetic, Nancy thought as she rolled over the causeway to the tiny island. Inside, however, the place had been fitted up in complete modern style. Nancy and George were happy to find Bess snuggled by a fireplace in the lounge. I'm glad you're back, she said, popping up. I caught a bus from Galway City. They took my bike on the roof. Nancy unzipped her windbreaker. Any luck? Bess nodded excitedly and sat forward on the couch. You'll never guess who Rhonda and Rachel's father is, she confided. Jacob Selkirk, Australian media magnate, George replied, plopping down beside her. Bess looked hurt. How did you know? Camilla, Nancy said, perching on the arm of the sofa. Derek was fired from the Selkirk paper, but he came on the tour to get a dirty scoop on the girls. But he gave up and left last night. Bess shook her head. Still, he wouldn't want to hurt them. But someone else does. Listen to this. Jacob Selkirk's newspaper, the Sydney Examiner, cracked a big Australian crime ring last fall. Ever since, the family's been receiving death threats. George whistled. So that's why Rhonda and Rachel lived in London last winter. For safety. Just then, they heard Rhonda in the entry hall. What do you mean you don't know where she is? She demanded. What kind of security do you call that? Look, Rhonda, they heard Bob Sharp reply. You want total security? Hire a bodyguard. Have you ever had a bodyguard? Rhonda shot back. It's such a downer. No thanks. Nancy saw Bob in the doorway, wearily rubbing his temples. Terry said Rachel called for a repair. He was going to pick her up. He's not answering his cell phone, though. I tried the bike shop in Cascamara to see if Terry and Rachel had arrived, but there's no answer there. I'll try Rachel's cell again. He unclipped his phone from his belt and dialed. The girls heard an answering ring outside. Bob perked up. I hear her, Rhonda flushed. No, that's on my bike. I kept the cell phone when I went out on my own. Bob's eyes began to bug out. You rode away and left her without communication? Stranded with a broken bike at the side of the road? Nancy saw Rhonda's eyes fill with tears. It wasn't broken then. Look, we had an argument. She got mad and rode away, and I happened to have the phone. Oh, where is she now? Nancy rose from the couch. After hearing Bess's news, she understood Rhonda's panic. Were Australian criminals stalking the Selkirks? She broke into the conversation. I remember seeing the bike shop when we rode through Cascamara. I'll be happy to ride back and check it out. For once, Nancy looked glad about Nancy's interference. Thanks, Nancy. That'd be great. Better hurry, though, Bob told Nancy. It's already 3:30. The tide comes in soon. By 5:10, the causeway will be impassable. When you're gone, I'll call the local Garda and ask if any road accidents have been reported. Nancy cycled back across the causeway, gazing uneasily at the encroaching waters on either side. She was well down the road on the mainland before she realized she hadn't taken a cell phone. In order to make it back across the causeway safely, though, she couldn't turn back. Studying the map, Nancy spotted a small inland road that seemed the most direct route to Cascamara. She swung onto it and cycled steadily. Then she saw a spot of red beside the road up ahead. Nancy pedaled hard, feeling a lump in her throat. The closer she got, the more sure she was of what it could be. It was the McLaney van, half overturned in a muddy ditch. As Nancy approached, she spotted tire tracks on the banks of the ditch, half washed out by the recent rainfall. Terry must have crashed shortly after he had called Bob, Nancy realized. The rain had started soon after the call, but the tracks headed north. Rachel's breakdown had been south of here. Where had Terry been going? Parking her bike, Nancy went to inspect the van. The passenger side door was jammed against a mound of dirt, but the driver's side door had been forced open a couple feet. She looked inside gingerly. No bodies. That was good. But there was a splatter of blood on the dashboard. She touched it. It was still sticky and fresh. Beside the gear shift, the mobile phone sat in its bracket. Nancy took it out and tried to turn it on, but the battery had gone dead. She went around to the dented back door and opened it. The back of the van was empty. No magenta bike waiting for a repair. Nancy began to search the immediate area. A set of large footprints led away from the van, clear in the mud. Only one pair, weaving from side to side. One person had walked this way unsteadily, maybe days from the crash. If these are Terry's footprints, he didn't have Rachel with him, Nancy thought. As the prints reached the surrounding bracken, they disappeared, leaving no impression on the tough sod. Nancy frowned. If she had a cell phone, she could call Bob with the police. Now she'd have to ride for help. She hadn't passed any houses along this road. That meant the monastery on the island was the nearest help. She jumped on her bike again and rode north a quarter mile or so. Then she screeched to a halt. There was a second pair of tire tracks in the mud. But if a passerby had stopped to help Terry, why were these tracks so far from the wrecked van? Nancy straddled her bike. Nancy straddled her bike. These were smaller tires, probably a car's. Several muddy footsteps, all jumbled together, covered a pavement near the tracks, as if there had been a scuffle. Then the car tracks made a U-turn, heading south. These last tracks were sharply pressed in the mud, as if they'd been made later after the rain. There was no time to lose. Nancy sped back to the island, anxiously checking her watch. It was 5 minutes past 5 when she reached the causeway. The road looked like a paved strip of ocean, water rising over the top of the stone banks. Nancy licked her lips. The causeway was only half a mile long. Surely she could cover that distance in 5 minutes. But the seawater was considerably rougher than it had been earlier. Already the highest waves splashed onto the road. What if the rainstorm today made the water higher than usual? Nancy wondered tersely. Would the road stay clear long enough for her to reach the island? Alright. And I know we said that today this was going to be the last reading, but there are a few more chapters. So we're going to pick up again tomorrow with chapter 13, Too Late. Alright, and I hope you enjoyed today's reading. Hope you stay safe and have a nice day. Thanks. Goodbye.